But this morning, we're all together, and we're here, and so I've been praying about, Lord, what do you want me to speak? Where do you want me to go? And so the message is how to stand in faith this morning. That's the title of it. But it's been on my heart a lot lately that I know many of you are going through some battles. I know many of you are facing things you thought you never faced. You're overwhelmed like you've never been here before. And so I've been praying, Lord, how can we show them? How can we tell them? What can we, do we have a strategy, a battle plan? How can we be overcomers, or how do we win? And I really just felt like the Lord speaking to my heart and reminded me that we have everything we need to stand in faith. I just want to remind you this morning of how to stand in faith. I'll remind you the weapons we have available to us and how we're going to stand, how we are going to be overcomers this morning. And so I made me a promise this morning, as best as you can, stick with me. I know the bacon is starting to settle in now. I know like the bacon grease has really kind of went through all your pores now, and the eyelids are getting really heavy. But try to stay with you this morning, because we're going to see some cool things. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the life of Daniel. And so as I've been praying this, on Wednesday nights, we've been going through the book of Daniel. And we just wrapped the book of Daniel up on Wednesday nights. And I really felt like the Lord keep bringing me back through there. So let me just run through some things in the book of Daniel. And so what you see in the book of Daniel, first 6 chapters is really about the life of Daniel. And you know most of the stories, right? And so chapter 1, Daniel and his friends, they were kept on a healthy diet of vegetable soup, and God was telling them through that process, I remember you, right? We can understand that. In chapter 2, you saw Nebuchadnezzar had this statue, and it was replaced, it was taken out by a heavenly rock. And in that part, God was telling the boys, I will rescue you. And then chapter 3, one, like a son of God, appears to Daniel and his friends in the fiery furnace, and we know there that God was saying, I am right here with you. And then chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, he got restored from animal-like instincts, and God was saying, I restore the humble, right? And then chapter 5, when the writing was on the wall, God was saying, I remove the proud. And so you go through the chapter, you see some very cool things in the life of Daniel. And then you get to chapter 6. This is one of my favorite ones in chapter 6. If you grew up in Sunday school, you definitely saw the little felt diagrams of this one, right? Daniel in a lion's den. Daniel is a handsome young man, and the lions look more like kittens. You saw that in your flannel graph, right? And we understand these stories. And so you look at that, and this is like Pastor Steve was talking a few weeks back about, we see the highlights, don't we? We see the highlights of Daniel's life. We're like, man, he's got it. Okay, well, let's look at Daniel's life for a second. What was Daniel? He was favored, right? Yeah, he was favored. He was still a slave. He was living in captivity. All this time, Daniel's still a slave. All this time, they're still living in a pagan land, aren't they? All this time, his people are still slaves. All this time, Jerusalem is not restored. The temple's not being built. All this time. You see all these miracles God's doing in Daniel's life. We know that he's praying. But yet, when you come down to it, he's still a slave. He's still in captivity. Daniel's been praying for years and years, 3 times a day for years. And really, he has seen nothing for that. I believe there's those this morning that can relate to this. I believe that God is going to speak directly to some of you who've been praying for a very long time. Some of you have been believing God would do something significant. You've been praying, you've been believing, and you haven't seen any results. You feel Daniel's pain. When he was in the lion's den, he was 80 years old. 80! And he's still in the same place. Nothing's happened. He has nothing to show for this. Except he's still alive. I mean, that's a pretty big miracle. But his prayers, nothing's happened. In fact, I think there's so many of you this morning that are praying and believing for miracles in so many different areas of your life. Some of you praying for your children or a loved one to come to Christ. Some of you are praying for a breakthrough, maybe overcome depression, maybe a financial breakthrough, maybe a relational breakthrough in your life. Some of you are praying for a physical miracle in your body, for healing, or maybe healing for someone else. Or some of you are praying maybe for your marriage, maybe restoration for that marriage. Whatever it is, you've been believing God for a very long time for something significant, and still you have no results. I believe God's going to minister to you in a powerful way this morning. As I mentioned, Daniel in the lion's den, he was 80 years old in this story. Now we get to chapter 10 in Daniel, and he's even older now. In chapter 10, he's even older, and he still has nothing to show for it. In fact, he's an old man, and literally for decades upon decades, he's been standing firm in the faith, hasn't he? Believing that God will do some miracles. And you know how Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple. This is where it started. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple. He captured all these young men and made them into slaves. And Daniel, for decades, has been praying that God will restore the temple that was destroyed. He's been praying for decades that his Jewish brothers and sisters who've been in bondage for all these years would be released to go home. And now there are some signs that this might actually happen. But then we get to chapter 10, and all of a sudden he receives a vision from God that was so disturbing to him that all he could do was seek God in prayer. What he saw a vision of more war, more hardships, and he's like, I've been praying for decades, and this is what I see coming, more hard times. I can't take this. How many is there this morning? You've been praying for decades for this one thing. You've been praying forever for one thing. And you get a glimpse of maybe something going to happen. And it's like, boom, you get hit again. You're like, I can't take it no more. I literally cannot take another thing in my life right now. This is where we find Daniel at. And Daniel's got a choice to stand in faith. And let's see what Daniel does here. So Daniel does what Daniel always does. He sought God in prayer. Come on. He sought God in prayer. 21 days he went on a fast. Fasting for 21 days, he wore no fragrant lotions. That means he didn't take a bath, which is pretty rough after 21 days. But for 21 days, he fasted. And at the end of the 21 days, he had this vision of this angelic being. Right? If you read it out, you can read all this about it. But he has this vision about this angelic being. And now as we read this in Daniel 10, let me just tell you, we're not totally sure who this angelic being is. But I believe, with a lot of biblical scholars, that this is probably the pre-incarnated Christ. Okay, so stick with me. All right? Visions are always crazy, but this one gets a little crazy. So stick with me. So we believe, I believe, and a lot of scholars believe, this was a pre-incarnated Christ. And what does that mean? Okay? Well, if you remember, God was what? God was before the foundations of the world, correct? Okay, God is the Trinity, means the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, a mystery we cannot explain here on earth, right? And then Jesus appears in the New Testament in a bodily form, right? We understand this. But he also appears in the Old Testament. And so this is known as Christophany. So there's a theological word for you to drop on somebody at lunch someday. They'll think you're a scholar, all right? Christophany. And so that's what this is describing. And this is not 100%, right? But I'm going to preach it as if it was Christ. Because if I'm ever going to err, I'm going to err on the side of Christ, right? And so this is what my thinking is, okay? And so here's a vision in chapter 10, verses 5 through 8 is a vision. Let's look at it. I looked up and saw a man dressed in linen cloth, with a belt of pure gold around his waist. His body looked like a precious gem. His face flashed like lightning. His eyes flamed like torches. His arms and feet shone like the polished bronze, and his voice roared like a vast multitude of people. Only I, Daniel, saw this vision. The men with me saw nothing, but they were suddenly terrified and ran away to hide. So I was left there all alone to see this amazing vision. My strength left me, and my face grew deathly pale, and I felt very weak. You notice Daniel was the only one that saw this vision. The other guys didn't see it. And we don't know for sure but what this is, but have you ever gotten like a word from the Lord? Or maybe you've read your Bible and you're reading, and this passage of Scripture you read like 10 times already, and you read it again, it's like, boom, God hits you with a special little nugget just for yourself. Excuse me. And you get so excited, don't you? And you go and share that with your friends. Like, yeah, you won't believe what God just showed me in this verse. You share it with them like, yeah, you want to go get lunch? Like, no, you understand what God said to me, and you're all excited, but they have no clue, so they're like, let's eat. And so this is probably what's happening here with this. He's like, look at this verse, isn't it amazing? They're like, yeah, whatever. This is what happened to Daniel. And they did experience what Daniel did. And in verse 8, in the middle of the verse, he says this. He's in the presence of Christ, or this angelic being, right? He says this, my strength left me, my face grew deathly pale, and I felt very weak. And then watch what happens in verse 9. Then I heard the man speak. This is going to get good. I'm going to need some help because this is good. Then I heard the man speak. And when I heard the sound of his voice, I fainted and lie there with my face to the ground. That's powerful. I heard the sound of his voice. I could no longer stand. I fell down to my face is what Daniel's saying. What's this all about? This is saying, it simply is, he felt the glory of God. He experienced the glory of God in the presence of God. He couldn't do nothing but fall on his face. You've been there. Some of you have been there before. You know this will be true. When the Spirit of God moves and moves upon you, you can't stand. All you want to do is just get as low as you can because you realize in that moment who you are and who He is. It's the weight of His glory setting upon you, and that's what's happening to Daniel in this. He can't take it. He can't stand. In that moment with God, you're overwhelmed by His comfort, by His presence, by His assurance, and you just want to kneel, you want to sit down, you want to lay down, just experience the glory of God. So what does all this mean? How do we apply this to our lives? How do you stand firm in faith when you're praying and you don't see anything happen? And that's the question, isn't it? Pastor, how do we stand in faith? How do we stand encouraged when we're praying? I'm praying and I don't see anything happen. I get this question all the time. And so we're going to see three things to remind us about standing in faith. The first thing I want you to see this morning, that God cares more about you than you know. God cares more about you than you know. Verse 10 says this, Daniel says, just then a hand touched me and did what? Just then a hand touched me and lifted me up. Doesn't it say that? The hand of God never extends to condemn. It always extends to lift. And this is what Daniel is saying in verse 10. Just then the hand touched me and lifted me up. I believe in all my heart some of you guys this morning are going to experience that. The hand of God lifting you up. He says, still trembling to my hands and my knees. Verse 11, and the man said to me, this is so good, right? And the man said to me, you are very precious to God. Come on. In his darkest hours, he doesn't know what he's going to do. He had hope, and then that hope got crushed. I've been praying all this time. I don't know what to do. I've fallen on my knees saying, take it no more. And in the hand of God, reaches out and touches him. And God says to him, you're very precious to me. You mean more to God. You mean more to God than you know. Some of you, this is your moment. This is what you need to hear. This is why you're here today, to hear that you're precious to God. You're valuable to God. He loves you. He cares about you. There's nothing you can do to make Him love you more. There's nothing you can do to make Him love you less this morning. He loves you more than you know. You're precious to God. That word precious here, it means valuable, right? We love a lot of people, but there's not a lot of people that are precious to me. My children are precious to me, right? My wife is precious to me. Pastor Mike, well, He's not precious to me, right? I love Pastor Mike. I love him. But I never tell him you're precious, right? That'd just be awkward. That'd be weird, right? I love Pastor Mark. Love him to death. I don't know what I'd do without Pastor Mark. He's precious to somebody, but just not me. But God looks at you with that same kind of love that you have for your children, that you have for your spouse, that a loving father has. You're precious to him. And you need to hear that this morning. He cares more about you than you even know. More than you care about yourself, he cares about you. Daniel goes on, and the voice says to Daniel, you're precious to God, so listen carefully to what I have to say to you. Stand up, for I've been sent to you. Christ says, when he said this to me, I stood up trembling. He comes to Daniel and says, you're precious to me, now stand up. Come on. Some of you better get excited about this morning, because this message is weighing heavy this morning. You're precious to him. So the thing to remember when you're standing firm in faith, that God cares about you more than you know. The second thing to remember, that God is doing more than you know. In your life, God is doing more than you know, more than you could ever understand. God is doing in your life. This is so cool, verse 12. Then he said, don't be afraid, Daniel, since the first, look at this. I'm telling you, if this doesn't get you excited, we need to go to prayer right now. Since the first day you began to pray. When? When? Since the first day you begin to pray for understanding and humble yourself before God, your request has been heard in heaven. Oh, come on. You need to know that this morning. Since the first day, some of you are standing there like, I've been praying forever, God has not heard me. Baloney. Since the first day you said that prayer, he's heard your cry. Since that first day, guess what? Heaven started stirring. Oh, since the first day you bowed your knee, it says heaven started waking up and said, well, what's going on? Somebody's praying. Since the first day you began to pray for understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your request has been heard in heaven. I have come to answer your prayer. Now it goes on in verse 13. I got to warn you, you think it's weird so far, it's going to get a little stranger yet. But stay with me because it's very cool. But in verse 13, but for 21 days the spirit prince of the kingdom of Persia blocked my way. Then Michael, one of the archangels, came to help me. And I left him there with the spirit of the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Let's talk about this because this is very interesting. For those of you who've been praying for so long, you wonder if it's worth it. You just wonder if my prayers are doing anything. Those of you who've been praying for so long, you hear that voice in the back of your head saying, why even bother? God doesn't care. I mean, if God was going to do something, wouldn't he have done it a long time ago? You heard that same voice I hear. You're praying and you're just wasting your breath. God's not listening. He's not doing anything. It must not be his will. And so you hear the lies of the enemy flooding your mind, telling you it's not worth it. Why even pray? He's not listening. He doesn't care. Those of you who have it in your heart, I want you to understand the first time you prayed, God heard your cry. The first time you prayed for healing for that person, God heard your prayer. The first time you prayed for your child and begged God to do a miracle, he heard your cry. The first time you prayed, our good God heard your prayer. And God loves a persistent prayer, doesn't he? He loves when you continue to cry out to him. He loves faithful and persistent prayer of his saints. But the very first time you called on him, heaven heard that prayer. The first time you cried out in faith, believing heaven opened and God heard your prayer. In verse 13, this is so cool. I want you to see that this morning. But for 21 days, the Spirit Prince, 21 days. Let me ask you this. How many days did Daniel fast? 21 days. Isn't that interesting? 21 days, the Spirit Prince of the kingdom of Persia blocked my way. Now, who is this, the Spirit Prince of the kingdom of Persia? Again, we're not totally sure, but most biblical scholars believe, and I agree with them, that this is a demonic force, is what they're talking about. This is a demonic force. And if you remember, some of the angels rebelled against God in the early days, and they're known as fallen angels, right? And many believe that there were demonic forces that do battle in the kingdom of the world today. And what we have to remember, you and I have to remember, is that we battle not what? Not against the flesh, not against blood, but against what? Against powers, against principalities of this dark world. In other words, what you see with your eyeballs is not all there is. We're in a spiritual battle, and there's forces that you cannot see battling against you this morning. And we need to understand that. Don't ever believe that this physical realm is all there is. For 21 days after you pray, Christ was sent. He was doing battle in the heavenly realms with his evil forces. And then what happens? Then Michael, one of the archangels, came to back him up, and he cried out to him. So this angelic being says, I left him there. So I left Michael there to handle business. You deal with this prince of Persia. I'm going to go to be with Daniel. I'm going to go answer Daniel's prayers. Here's what's powerful that is about me to this to me. Think about it. Daniel prayed, right? He continued to pray. He continued to pray. And what did he see? Nothing. You're like, whoa, what? Yes. Daniel prayed. He continued to pray. And he didn't see nothing. He didn't see a thing. He didn't see anything. But just because he didn't see anything didn't mean God wasn't doing something, does it? God was up to something. God was fighting. That first time he prayed, he said, heaven heard him. That first time he had prayed, Jesus is up there. What does Jesus do? Interceding on our behalf, right? So Jesus interceding. He's sending angels down. He's sending angels down to battle with him. He said, all right, I hear that prayer. I'm going to go help him out. For the first time. And Daniel didn't see any of this happening. So Daniel's sitting there thinking, all my prayers going in unanswered. You're sitting there thinking, God has not heard my cry. When you don't know there's a war going up in heaven for you. There's a war going on against demonic forces on your behalf, and you don't see nothing going. But I promise you, something's happening in the spiritual realm on your behalf. God's up to something. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean God's not doing something. I know this is speaking to someone because you've been praying for a long time. You've been praying, you've been crying out to God, and you haven't seen anything. Just because you don't see anything doesn't mean nothing's happening. The first time, some of you need to hang on to this, the first time you cried out to God, the first time you said that prayer, he's sending the angelic forces out to do warfare on your behalf. That's what you need to understand. And you just keep praying. You just keep believing. You may not see anything. You have no idea what kind of battle is going on your behalf. What kind of battle is going on from a God who loves you so much. He's working behind the scenes to do things you cannot see or you won't even understand, because that's how much he cares for you. And the kingdom of light will overcome the kingdom of darkness. 21 days earlier, when Daniel still saw nothing, there's a battle going on in heaven. Because heaven heard his prayer the first time he prayed. So how do you stand in faith? How do you keep standing in faith? You remember, he cares more about you than you know. Because he's doing way more than you know. Doing way more than you can understand. Number 3, God's strength is made perfect in your weakness. God's strength is made perfect in his weakness. In fact, this is a New Testament principle. Paul actually said that in your weakness, his strength is made perfect. Some of you are going to come to a place in your faith where you feel like you have nothing left. You're at the end of your string. Let me tell you, that's when you're at the strongest. Because let me illustrate it this way. You guys know I enjoy going to the gym. I enjoy working out. It's kind of a stress relief. I find just quietness in that, and I like that. And if you ever work out, if you're ever doing anything, if you're doing it's really helpful in the bench, or if you're doing a bench with dumbbells, to get a spotter, right? Because the thing is, if you never push yourself, what essentially happens when you push yourself to where you can't do anymore, it actually ends up tearing muscles, and that's how you build muscle, right? But if you don't ever push yourself, you're never going to grow. And so when you're working out, You got to get a spotter because why? You got to go till you have nothing left in the tank, right? And in that last moment, they're yelling at you to push, push, push. You're like, I'm pushing with all I got. In that moment, what happens? That spotter takes over, and they're fresh, baby. They're fresh, they're ready to go, and they've got you. And they take all that weight off your shoulders, and they're helping you get it up. Why? Because you don't have the strength to do it. What does it say? Come on, in your weakness, His strength is made perfect. In your weakness, that's when the Lord steps in and says, I got this. You just keep standing there. I've got this. I've got you. You just keep praying. I've got you. Why? Because in your weakness, that's when He shines the best. That's when He shines because no longer it's not under your power. It's under His power, isn't it? Come on. Come on. Somebody get excited this morning. I feel like I'm preaching by myself, and this is good stuff. It's not in your own power, but it's His power when everything becomes real. Listen, until you fully embrace your weakness, you'll never appreciate His strength and His experience. I want to ask the worship team if they'll come back this morning. When you realize I prayed and I don't have any more faith, I physically do not have any more strength. I'm at the end of myself. And some of you may be there this morning. I've been there in the past. Some of you may be there right now. That you have nothing. I'm even tired of praying. I don't know if I could say another prayer this morning. I can't stand. You're at the end of yourself. That's when His power becomes more real than ever before in your life. Until you embrace your weakness, you'll never fully understand your strength. Verse 17, this is what Daniel says to Christ, or the angelic being. He says this, he says, how can someone like me, your servant, talk to you, my Lord? My strength is gone. I can hardly breathe. Some of you are right now there this moment. My strength is gone. I can hardly breathe. My strength is gone. I've been hanging on this marriage. I can't do it anymore. I've been hanging on for my kids. I've been fighting for this. Financially, I just don't think I can make it anymore. My strength is gone. I can barely breathe. Look at verse 18. Then the one who looked like a man, he touched me again. And this is what happened. Daniel said, I felt my strength return. When He touched me again, I felt my strength return. Come on, somebody. Don't miss the power of this. When He touched me, I felt my strength return. Some of you, this is all you need. This is it. This is your God moment. One touch and your faith is restored this morning. One touch and you're coming back to Christ this morning. One touch and you're believing God for that thing that you stopped believing in for years ago. One touch. One touch is enough to keep on going this morning. One touch and your strength is returned this morning. One touch from the presence of Christ and everything changes in your life. Come on. I have no strength. I'm ready to give up. One touch and I felt my strength return. And Christ says to him, verse 19, don't be afraid, He said. In other words, in case you didn't hear it, I'm going to tell you again, don't be afraid, for you are very precious to me. Peace, be encouraged, be strong. That's what God wants you to hear this morning. Don't be afraid. You're very, very precious to me this morning. Peace, be encouraged, be strong. You can keep standing in faith because the first time you prayed, God heard your prayer. The first time you prayed, He released angelic forces to do work in the heavenly realms. He may do exactly what you're praying for, or He may not. But just because you don't see anything doesn't mean He's not doing something. And people are going to look at you, they're going to be wondering, like, how are you still standing? How are you still hanging on there? How come you have not given up? You're going to say, because I don't understand, but I know this. I know that He cares more about me than I even know. I know that He's doing way more than I know or I even understand. I know this, that His strength is made perfect in my weakness. So I've embraced my weakness and I've tapped into His strength. That's how I stand this morning. And what you need to understand is I continue to believe with everything in me, because the first time I prayed, heaven heard my prayer. That's my faith this morning. I trust in a God who is good, and a God who is working all things out to bring good to those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. That's how I continue to stand this morning. Just because you don't see anything happening doesn't mean God's not up to something. This is how we overcome this morning. This is how we stand. This is how we don't give up. This is how, when you see the life of Daniel, you say he's over 80. He has not seen any movement in his prayer life. But guess what? After Daniel passes, guess what begins to happen? This last king he served with, he is actually a part of ushering the children of Israel going back. The start of the temple. So it was accomplished. But Daniel didn't get to see it. But guess what Daniel did? He stood in faith. He stood in faith because he knew the first time he prayed, heaven stood up. Heaven got ready to fight. This morning we're going to fight. If you go back to the book of Esther, you know the story of Esther, how God did a mighty work. Esther becomes Queen Esther. If you know, she's fighting for the same thing, fighting for her people, right? Well, the king made a law, and you cannot, once the king sealed that, you can't do nothing against it, right? So she said, okay, I understand that. So what she asked for? She said this, give me permission to fight. Give me permission for my people to fight. Today, the Lord has given you permission to fight. And this is how we stand. This is how we fight in our prayers.